The chain was already on the ground. 80 feet of heavy iron links stretched between two machines like a line drawn in the dirt between two different centuries. On one end sat a John Deere 9R brand new green paint, so fresh it still caught the morning sun like a mirror. 620 horsepower waiting behind a touchscreen. $485,000 of engineering that could read soil composition, calculate traction coefficients, and adjust torque distribution 200 times per second without a human hand touching a single control. On the other end sat something that looked like it had rolled straight out of a faded photograph. A 1915 Case steam tractor, iron wheels, brass fittings, a boiler the color of old rust and older stories. 45 horsepower on a good day with a patient hand and favorable conditions. And sitting on that iron seat alone, no crew, no sponsors, no matching shirts with corporate logos, was a 73-year-old man named Walter Hayes. The crowd didn't just doubt him. They had already written the ending. 300 people pressed against the wooden rails of the pull lane at Cumberland County Fair, Tennessee. It was July mid-morning, the kind of heat that settles over the land and doesn't lift until October. The air smelled of cut grass, gone dry diesel exhaust, coal smoke from Walter's boiler, and that particular mineral scent of ground that hasn't seen rain in 3 weeks. Somewhere behind the crowd, a popcorn machine hissed and popped, but nobody was paying attention to the concession stands anymore. Every eye had found its way to those two tractors and the impossible gulf between them. Have you ever watched someone walk into something impossible, where everyone around you already knows how it ends except maybe the person in the middle of it? That's what Cumberland County saw that morning. But what they didn't know could fill a book. Walter had arrived at 5:20 in the morning, driving a 1989 Ford flatbed truck the color of faded denim. The vendors were still setting up their booths. The smell of funnel cake hadn't hit the air yet. The grounds were quiet except for the birds and the soft creak of the wooden gate swinging shut behind him. He backed the flatbed into position near the pull lane, lowered the ramps himself, and eased the 1915 Case down to the ground the way you'd help an old friend out of a car. Careful, steady, no rush. Then he checked the boiler pressure, checked the drive chains, checked the water level in the gauge. Glass poured himself a cup of black coffee from a thermos and sat on the running board of his old truck, watching the sun climb over the fairground's eastern fence. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't need to. Walter Hayes stood 5'10" with skin tanned the deep brown that comes from 50 years under Tennessee sun. His hair had gone white, and he kept it cut short, military style, though he'd never served. His hands were something else entirely. Calloused, scarred, the knuckles enlarged from decades of gripping plow handles and wrenches, the fingertips permanently stained with machine oil, no amount of scrubbing would lift. He wore a flannel shirt the color of deep water, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin. Carhartt jeans, leather boots that had seen 15 winters and still had a few more in them if he treated the leather right. When he moved with the economy of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste motion on anything that didn't need doing. The Case, 1915, had belonged to his father, Robert Hayes, who died in 1998. Walter had promised him in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and approaching death that he would never sell the machine. That promise had cost him more than he'd expected. After his wife, Patricia, died of lung cancer In 2019, Walter had spent every spare moment in the barn with that steam tractor, keeping it running, keeping it ready, keeping the promise alive, because it was the only promise he had left to keep. His daughter Rebecca had moved to Chicago in 2015 to work as a corporate lawyer. They didn't talk much. She wanted him to sell the farm, retire, enjoy life. He'd told her the farm was his life. She'd stopped calling after that. But there was something else the crowd didn't know, something that pressed against Walter's chest every time he breathed. Hayes Farm owed Cumberland County Bank $127,000. 3 weeks of drought had destroyed 40% of this season's crop. Property taxes had jumped 18%. Walter had already put up 200 acres as collateral just to cover last year's operating costs. He had 150 acres left. If those went to the bank, the farm went with them. Everything his grandfather William had built starting in 1947. Everything his father Robert had protected through recessions and bad harvests and years when the rain didn't come and the bank came calling anyway. Everything Patricia had believed in when she married him in 1976 and chose a farmer's life over the easier paths her parents had wanted for her. Walter needed $5,000. That was the prize money for first place in today's poll competition. $5,000 would pay 3 months of interest to the bank. It would buy time. Time to figure out the next move, time to pray for rain, time to do what farmers do when the ground stops cooperating, adapt and survive. He climbed onto the case at 8:15, a full half hour before the competition was scheduled to start. The iron seat had no padding, no suspension, no mercy for a 73-year-old man's back. But Walter knew that seat better than he knew most people. He settled onto it, rested his hands on his knees, and looked straight down the pull lane toward the white flag someone had pressed into the dirt at the center point. His eyes were the gray-blue of winter sky, calm, patient. The eyes of a man who'd spent 5 decades learning that the land teaches you if you're willing to listen and punishes you if you're not. The sound that interrupted that morning calm came from the east gate, a deep, expensive rumble. Not the working truck sound of diesel and duty, but the polished note of money and intention. A Ram 3500, limited black paint chrome everywhere that chrome could go, pulled through the gate, towing a custom enclosed trailer. The trailer alone probably cost more than Walter's entire truck. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Kendall, 31 years old, wearing a performance polo shirt with the logo Kendall Agricultural Solutions embroidered over the pocket. He drove the way people drive when they've never had to worry about the cost of replacing tires. Marcus Kendall was 6'1", athletic, in the way of someone who had time for a gym membership and a trainer. His hair was brown styled with product that caught the light. Oakley sunglasses, Apple Watch. Everything about him said success achievement, the kind of confidence that comes from never having truly failed at anything that mattered. He pulled to a stop near the prep area, killed the engine, and stepped out into the July heat like a man walking onto a stage he owned. 2 other men climbed out with him. Brandon Pierce, 29 agricultural engineer, carried a tablet and wore the focused expression of someone whose job was to make sure the machines performed exactly as the specifications promised. Stephen Cole, 26, tech specialist, had his phone out before his feet hit the ground, already checking weather data, soil reports, anything that could give them an edge. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had practiced this routine, that had invested real time and real money into being ready for moments like this. What the crowd didn't know about Marcus Kendall was that he wasn't third-generation money playing at farming. His father, Richard Kendall, was a corporate executive at a pharmaceutical company. Richard had wanted Marcus to study business, join the company, climb the ladder takeover when the time came. Marcus had chosen farming specifically to prove he didn't need his father's path. He'd bought 850 acres of Cumberland bottomland 3 years ago, using a trust fund from his mother, Elizabeth, who died in 2018. The land was good, the equipment was better, but Marcus had 3 years of book learning and not much else. He'd graduated from the University of Tennessee with a degree in agricultural business in 2015, spent 2 years at a consulting firm, then bought the farm in 2021 and started calling himself a farmer. Today was different. Today his father was coming to watch. Richard Kendall had never seen Marcus work. The land never witnessed what his son had built. That knowledge sat in Marcus's stomach like a stone. If he failed here in front of 300 people and his father, the unspoken words would hang between them forever. "I told you so. You should have joined the company. This was a waste." Marcus looked across the pull lane at the 1915 case and the old man sitting on it. He turned to Brandon. "How is that thing even running?" Brandon glanced at the steam tractor, then back at his tablet. "Steam power. Technically sound, just old." Marcus adjusted his sunglasses. "Old means obsolete." Stephen looked up from his phone. "Want me to record this for the farm's social media?" Marcus nodded. "Every second, start with the setup." The prep work began. Brandon lowered the trailer ramp, and Marcus climbed into the John Deere's cab. The machine came to life with a low, controlled rumble that spoke of turbocharged diesel and computer-managed combustion. Marcus backed it down the ramp with the smooth precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd practiced in fields when nobody was watching, who'd put in the hours despite what anyone assumed about him. He positioned the tractor at his end of the pull lane, killed the engine, and climbed down. Brandon was already circling the machine with his tablet, checking tire pressure, recording baseline data, making notes about ground conditions. From the other end of the lane, Walter watched. He didn't judge, didn't dismiss, just observed. The young man had good equipment and people who knew how to use it. That wasn't nothing, but equipment and knowledge weren't the same thing as understanding. Understanding took time. It took seasons. It took watching crops fail and figuring out why. It took promises you couldn't break, even when breaking them would be easier. The crowd had started to swell. By 9 o'clock, more than 300 people lined the wooden rails. Younger farmers, mostly in their 30s and 40s, gravitated toward Marcus's side. They held phones recording, talking loud, the energy of people who believed in data and technology and the future. The older generation, men and women in their 60s and 70s, gathered near Walter's end, quieter, respectful. They knew what a 1915 case represented. Some of them had grandfathers who'd worked machines like that. Some of them remembered when steam power wasn't a curiosity, but the backbone of every serious farm operation in Tennessee. In the neutral zone, families spread blankets and opened coolers. Children climbed the fence posts for a better view. A girl, maybe 8 years old, asked her father why the old man was fighting the big tractor. Her father looked at Walter for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes the old ways surprise you, honey. Just watch." At 9:15, a black Lexus LS 500 pulled into the VIP parking area near the viewing stands. The door opened and Richard Kendall stepped out. 57-years-old gray suit despite the July heat, the posture of a man who spent his life in boardrooms making decisions that affected thousands of people he'd never meet. Beside him, his business associate, Jonathan Wright, emerged from the passenger side, 62 CFO of Kendall Pharmaceuticals, checking his watch like a man who had better places to be. Marcus saw his father arrive. His chest tightened. Brandon noticed. "Boss, you good?" Marcus nodded but didn't speak. Richard walked to the viewing area, found a spot near the rail, crossed his arms. His expression gave nothing away. Marcus crossed the distance between them. "Dad, I didn't think you'd make it." Richard's voice was level professional, the same tone he used in conference calls. "Your secretary mentioned it. I had a gap in schedule. A gap. 2 hours. Then I have a call with Tokyo." Marcus wanted to say something more, but the words died in his throat. Richard looked past him, at the pull lane, at the 2 tractors, at the chain, lying on the ground between them. Jonathan Wright leaned close and whispered something Marcus couldn't hear. Richard's expression didn't change. Walter observed the interaction from his seat on the case. He'd seen fathers like that before. Men who measured their sons by metrics that had nothing to do with dirt under fingernails or promises kept in hospital rooms. He thought about his own father, Robert, who taught him everything that mattered by showing him instead of telling him, by working beside him instead of standing back and evaluating. The difference between those approaches was everything. At 9:30, Donald Morrison stepped onto the pull lane with a megaphone. 59 years old, white hair, the kind of solid build that comes from manual work and good genetics. He'd run the Cumberland County Fair for 21 years. He'd known Walter's father. They'd been friends back when Robert was still alive, when they'd meet at the diner on Saturday mornings and talk about weather and crops and the way the land changed year to year. Donald had watched Walter grow up, had seen him marry Patricia, had stood at her funeral in 2019 and put his hand on Walter's shoulder without saying a word, because there were no words that would help. Beside Donald stood his wife Pamela, 56, wearing a simple dress and a concerned expression. She'd been Patricia's best friend. She saw Walter sitting alone on that old machine, and her heart broke a little. She walked over, carrying a mason jar. Sweet tea, extra ice, Patricia's favorite. Walter took it, their hands touching briefly. "Thank you, Pam." She wanted to say more, but knew better. Some moments didn't need words. She squeezed his shoulder and walked back to Donald's side. Somewhere in the crowd, unnoticed by Walter, stood Timothy Brennan, 44 years old, manager of Cumberland County Bank. In his briefcase, folded in a manila envelope, was a 90-day foreclosure notice for Hayes Farm. He'd planned to deliver it Monday morning. Bank policy. The board had voted. Timothy had argued against it, said Walter Hayes was good for the debt, said the man had never missed a payment until the drought hit, said some things mattered more than quarterly earnings. The board had overruled him. Timothy stood there now, watching Walter on that ancient machine, feeling the weight of what he'd have to do when Monday came. He thought about his own father, who'd farmed 80 acres until arthritis made him sell. He thought about what it means to take away a man's land. The thought made him sick. Donald raised the megaphone. "All right, folks, we're about ready to start. Let me go over the rules one more time." His voice carried across the fairground, cutting through conversation, drawing attention. "We've got 80 feet of chain tested to 50,000 pounds tension. Best of 3 rounds. First machine to pull their opponent 10 feet past center wins that round. 2 rounds out of 3 takes the trophy. Safety check boiler pressure stays below the red line at 180 psi. We've got 3 judges, me and 2 volunteer farmers. Questions. Silence. Everyone knew the rules. This was the part before the part that mattered. Prize money. First place, $5,000 cash plus trophy. Second place, $1,500. Third place, $500. Walter's hands tightened on his knees. 5,000. 3 months of breathing room. Time to figure out rain crops, bank payments, everything. Donald continued. Now we've got ourselves an interesting matchup here. On the north end, Marcus Kendall with a John Deere 9R, 620 horsepower, latest technology, fresh off the showroom floor. On the south end, Walter Hayes with a 1915 Case Steam tractor, 45 horsepower, built when Woodrow Wilson was president and still running like the day it rolled out of the factory. A few people laughed. Not mean exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes when the outcome seems obvious. The technical gap was enormous. The John Deere carried electronic traction management that could sense wheel slip and redistribute torque 60 times per second. It had dual turbochargers, a continuously variable transmission, GPS, guided weight distribution, real-time tire pressure adjustment. Marcus could change settings from his phone. The computer did calculus while he drove. The machine cost more than most people in that crowd would earn in 5 years. Walter's case ran on steam, generated by burning coal in a firebox. The throttle was a hand lever. The pressure gauge was analog. The wheels were cast iron with lug cleats that had been old when Walter's father was young. There was no GPS, no computer, no software updating over cellular networks. Just iron firewater and the hands of a man who'd been running that machine for 40 years. The crowd understood the numbers. Power-to-weight ratio favored the John Deere by more than 3 to 1. On paper, this wasn't a competition. It was a demonstration of how far agricultural technology had advanced in a century. But farming had taught Walter something about paper. It burns easy and tells you nothing about the ground. Marcus climbed into the John Deere's cab. The air conditioning kicked on immediately, cooling the interior to a comfortable 72 degrees, while the outside temperature pushed 96. He adjusted the seat, checked the mirrors, glanced at the touchscreen display. Everything showed green, optimal, ready. Brandon gave him a thumbs up from outside. Stephen started recording on his phone. Marcus looked across the pull lane one more time at Walter, sitting perfectly still on that iron seat, hands resting on his knees, looking ahead like a man waiting for a bus he knew was coming. Walter reached forward and touched a small piece of yellowed tape beside the pressure valve. His father's handwriting faded, but still legible, only when it matters. Robert had written that in 1987, the day he'd taught Walter about the red valve and what it could do and why you saved it for the moment when everything else had failed. Below his father's writing, Walter had added something the night before in fresh ink for Patricia, for the land. He whispered words nobody could hear. This matters. Donald Morrison raised the starting flag. The crowd pressed forward against the rails. Marcus's father uncrossed his arms for the first time since arriving, leaning slightly forward. Pamela Morrison closed her eyes, briefly praying for something she couldn't name. Timothy Brennan touched the foreclosure notice in his briefcase and felt its weight like a stone. The chain lay on the ground between 2 machines, 2 generations, 2 ways of understanding what it means to work the earth and keep promises and fight for something when reason says you should quit. In 5 minutes, 300 people would see something they'd never forget. In 1 hour, Walter Hayes would either save his farm or lose everything his family had built since 1947, and nobody, not Marcus, not the crowd, not even Walter himself, knew which way the ground would break. Donald dropped the flag. Part 1. Complete. 3,543 words. Continuing to target. But first, engines had to engage, and that moment stretched longer than it should have. Marcus's hand hovered over the throttle control. Walter's fingers tightened on the steam regulator. The crowd held its collective breath. Then both men moved at once, and the sound that filled Cumberland County Fair was something no one there would describe the same way twice. Some called it a roar. Others said it was more like the earth clearing its throat. Children covered their ears. The older farmers nodded once, recognizing something they'd heard before in a different time. The John Deere's diesel engine cycled up from idle to full power in less than a second. 620 horses pressed against mechanical restraints, waiting for permission to move. Black exhaust punched up from the vertical stack. The turbochargers spooled with a rising whine that vibrated in your chest. Marcus felt the machine respond to his commands through the steering wheel, through the seat, through every sensor, feeding data to the display in front of him. The computer told him traction was optimal, weight distribution was balanced, all systems were ready. He believed it because he'd paid engineers to make sure belief wasn't necessary. Just results. Walter's case responded differently. The boiler had been building pressure since 5:30 in the morning, since the first coal went into the firebox and the first water started converting to steam. He'd brought it up slowly, carefully, the way you wake someone who needs to be alert, but not startled. The pressure gauge read 145 psi. Good, solid, enough for the first round without pushing into dangerous territory. He opened the steam regulator 15 degrees, exactly no more, and felt the machine respond, the way you feel a horse respond to the reins. The flywheel began to turn. The drive chains pulled taut. The iron wheels prepared to bite earth. Donald Morrison stood at the center line, with his hand raised, watching both machines, making sure neither jumped early. He'd run this event for 2 decades, and he'd seen every kind of cheating, every shortcut, every attempt to game the system. But watching Walter Hayes and Marcus Kendall prepare for this pull, he saw something different. He saw 2 men who respected the rules because the rules gave meaning to what they were about to do. He dropped his hand and stepped back. The chain was still slack, lying in the dirt like something sleeping. Then it wasn't. The transition from rest to tension happened faster than human perception could track. 80 feet of iron links went from loose to rigid in the span of a single heartbeat. The sound was sharp, final, like something breaking instead of connecting. Conversation stopped. The vendors at the concession stands stopped selling. Even the horses tied near the livestock barn shifted uneasily in their stalls. Marcus had given the John Deere full throttle the instant Donald's hand dropped. The traction control system sensed the sudden load-calculated optimal torque distribution and sent power to the rear wheels with computer-managed precision. The 42-inch tires spun exactly half a rotation before the tread pattern found purchase in the packed dirt. Then they gripped, and the entire weight of the machine, 24,000 pounds of steel diesel and in tension, pressed forward against the chain. The case moved backward, not a lot, 3 feet, then 4. The iron wheels turned against their will, dragging shallow furrows in the July-hardened ground. The crowd on Marcus's side erupted. Phones went up. Someone threw a hat in the air. Brandon pumped his fist. Stephen kept recording, grinning like a man watching exactly what he'd predicted. Richard Kendall allowed himself the smallest nod of acknowledgement. This was the moment when most men would panic, when most operators would slam the throttle wide open, fight fire with fire, try to match modern power with old-fashioned will. The crowd expected it. Marcus expected it. Even some of the older farmers watching Walter's end of the lane expected it, because panic is what happens when the ground stops cooperating and you realize you're about to lose in front of everyone who matters. Walter Hayes did not panic. He reached forward slowly, deliberately, and opened the steam regulator by exactly the amount he had decided before the pull ever started. Not a fraction more. His hands moved the way hands move when they've done something 10,000 times and no longer need thought to guide them, just muscle memory and trust, and the certain knowledge that this machine would give him everything he asked for if he asked correctly. The boiler exhaled, a deep rhythmic pulse of steam from the relief valve. The flywheel spun faster. The drive chains pulled taut with mechanical inevitability. The iron wheels bit the earth. The backward movement stopped. 5 feet from the center line, the case held. For a long moment, 12 seconds by the count of the man with the stopwatch near the judge's table, both machines were absolutely locked. The chain between them vibrated like a guitar string, wound too tight. The ground between the two tractors trembled. Walter's boiler hissed in steady rhythm. Marcus's turbochargers screamed at full load. Neither machine moved an inch in either direction. Then the chain went slack. Donald Morrison stepped forward with a measuring tape, walking carefully on ground that had been compressed by forces most people only understood theoretically. He measured from the center flag to both machines. The flag stood within the neutral zone, less than 2 feet of movement in either direction. He raised both hands flat. Round 1, no winner, stalemate. The crowd went silent for exactly 2.4 seconds. Someone in the back actually counted. Then the noise came back, twice as loud, confusion and surprise mixing into something close to disbelief. Nobody had expected that. Not the people on Marcus's side who'd driven out to watch modern technology reassert its dominance. Not the people who'd come just to see the old machine lose with dignity. Not even if you watched his face carefully through the windshield, Marcus Kendall himself. He sat in the cab, with both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead at the back of Walter's head. His jaw was tight. His breathing had gone shallow. Brandon appeared at the driver's side door. Boss Marcus didn't answer immediately. He ran diagnostics on the touchscreen, checking every sensor, every reading, looking for the malfunction that would explain why 620 horsepower hadn't been enough to move 45 horsepower and a man who should have been outmatched before the flag dropped. The screen showed green across the board. Nothing wrong, nothing broken, nothing to fix. Brandon tried again. Want me to run a deeper analysis? Marcus finally looked at him. He just matched me. Brandon didn't know what to say to that. Stephen approached from the other side, phone still recording. Should we adjust the strategy for round 2? Marcus climbed down from the cab boots, hitting the dirt harder than necessary. He walked to the rear of the tractor, studying the tire marks, the chain position, anything that would give him data to replace the feeling settling in his stomach. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated something fundamental. From the other end of the pull lane, Walter climbed down from the case with the slow care of a 73-year-old man whose knees remembered every fall, every long day, every year. He walked to the rear wheel, knelt, and pressed his hand flat against the ground. He held it there for 20 seconds. Then he moved it 6 inches to the left and pressed again. He was reading something in that soil that his hands had learned to feel across 5 decades. Something about density moisture, the structure just beneath the surface that machines only touched from above. Pamela Morrison watched him and understood. Patricia had told her once what it meant to be married to Walter Hayes. It means trusting that when he puts his hand on the ground, he's listening to something that doesn't speak in words. It means believing in knowledge that doesn't come from books or screens. It means patience. Walter stood, brushed the dirt from his hand, and walked to his toolbox. He opened it, the hinges squeaked after 40 years, and reached inside. What he pulled out made several of the older farmers near his end of the lane straighten up and pay closer attention. An old wrench, hand-forged, curved the handle, worn smooth from use. Not just Walter's use, his father's, his grandfather's. 3 generations of hands had shaped that curve. He moved to the rear differential housing and made one adjustment. Small, deliberate, quiet, right there, kneeling in the dirt, 1 round away from either saving his farm or losing everything. Marcus saw him from across the pull lane. "What's he doing?" Brandon zoomed in with the tablet's camera. "Some kind of mechanical adjustment. Can't tell what from here." Stephen lowered his phone. "Is that legal?" Brandon checked the rule sheet on his screen. Nothing in the regulations against mechanical adjustments between rounds. As long as it's manual, it's allowed. Marcus watched Walter close the toolbox and climb back onto the iron seat. The old man's face showed nothing. No worry, no calculation, just the same calm that had been there since 5:30 in the morning. Richard Kendall had been watching too. He leaned toward Jonathan Wright. "What do you make of that?" Jonathan shrugged. "Old man stalling. Doesn't change the physics." Richard didn't respond. But something in Walter's movements reminded him of something he'd seen years ago in a different context. The deliberate care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need anyone's validation to do it. The crowd had settled into a different energy now. The easy confidence of Marcus's supporters had developed a crack. Not trod exactly, but something close. The older generation near Walter's end stood quieter than before, nodding to each other, remembering things they'd seen in their own youth when machines were simpler, and the men who ran them had to understand every moving part because there was no helpline to call, no tech support, no software update to solve the problem. Timothy Brennan moved through the crowd toward the concession stand, needing distance from what he was watching. The foreclosure notice felt heavier in his briefcase with every passing minute. He bought a lemonade he didn't want and stood in the shade of an oak tree watching Walter prepare for round 2. A woman standing nearby spoke to her husband. "Think he can do it again?" The husband shook his head. "Don't see how. That Deere's got too much power." Timothy wanted to tell them about the 90-day notice, about the bank board's decision, about how winning this pull might buy Walter 3 months, but wouldn't solve the fundamental math of debt versus revenue versus time. He wanted to say that sometimes courage isn't enough. But he kept quiet and drank his lemonade and watched an old man on an old machine refuse to accept what everyone else already knew. Walter touched the yellowed tape beside the pressure gauge one more time. His father's handwriting, his own addition. The words that mattered when everything else was just noise. He thought about Robert in that hospital room in 1998, weak but clear-eyed, making Walter promise. Thought about Patricia 5 years ago, also in a hospital, also dying, also asking for a promise. Some people go through life never having to keep promises that cost them everything. Walter wasn't one of those people. Donald Morrison checked his watch. Time to start round two. He raised the megaphone again, but before he could speak, a white Toyota Camry pulled into the far parking area. A woman stepped out. Professional clothes, exhausted posture. She looked around the fairground like someone trying to remember a place they'd left a long time ago. Rebecca Hayes had driven 8 hours straight through the night from Chicago. She'd canceled a deposition worth $40,000 in fees. She'd gotten the call from Pamela Morrison yesterday afternoon. Just 3 words, "Your father needs you." Rebecca had booked a flight, then realized flying wasn't fast enough. She'd thrown clothes in a bag, gotten in her car, and driven through darkness while her mind replayed the last conversation she'd had with Walter 6 months ago. The argument about selling the farm, his refusal, her frustration, the phone call that ended with silence instead of goodbye. She found Pamela near the viewing area. Pamela turned, saw her, pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than words. "You came." Rebecca was crying without knowing exactly why. "Is he okay?" Pamela pulled back, holding Rebecca's shoulders. "He's fighting, honey, fighting for everything. For what? For the farm, for your mother's memory, for the promise he made your grandfather, for all of it." Rebecca looked past Pamela's shoulder and saw her father sitting on the case. The distance between them, 50 yards of fairground dirt, felt like a canyon. She wanted to run to him, to tell him she understood now, to say she was sorry for every word that had tried to convince him to give up something that made him who he was. But Pamela held her back gently. "Not yet. He needs to focus. After this is over, you'll have time." Rebecca nodded, throat too tight for words. She moved into the crowd, hiding in the back where Walter wouldn't see her, where she could watch him fight for something she'd spent 6 months trying to convince him to surrender. Donald's voice carried across the fairground one more time. "Round 2. Competitors ready." Marcus nodded from the John Deere's cab. Walter raised his hand briefly from the case. The flag went up. 300 people leaned forward. A father watched his son. A daughter watched her father. A bank manager touched a foreclosure notice and prayed for an outcome that would let him sleep at night. The flag dropped, and Cumberland County held its breath. Marcus had made adjustments. Between rounds, while Walter knelt in the dirt reading soil with his bare hand, Marcus had been running numbers. Brandon stood beside the John Deere's cab with his tablet displaying ground analysis, tire pressure optimization, torque curve projections. The first round had taught them something valuable. Raw power wasn't enough when applied incorrectly. The computer had been set for general agricultural work, steady, reliable, efficient. What they needed now was competition mode, aggressive, uncompromising, every available horsepower directed toward a single purpose. Brandon's fingers moved across the screen. Firmware update downloading now. 30 seconds. Stephen monitored his phone, watching real-time weather data, soil composition reports pulled from satellite imaging, anything that could give them an edge the old man sitting on that steam tractor couldn't access. Ground analysis shows packed layers 0 to 4 inches, then softer substrate below. Traction control was compensating for surface conditions. We need it optimized for the exact patch of dirt we're pulling on. Marcus studied the data, his engineering degree, finally worth something beyond framed paper on an office wall. Competition mode, full aggression, and add 8 psi to the rear tires. Drop 2 from the front. Brandon tapped the screen. The tires visibly stiffened as compressed air filled them to new specifications. The contact patch changed shape, narrower but deeper, designed to bite rather than spread load. Stephen made notes on his phone, documenting every decision in case they needed to replicate this setup later. The John Deere had become more than a machine. It was a data collection platform, learning, adapting, responding to input faster than human reflexes could manage. Richard Kendall watched his son work and felt something unexpected. Not pride exactly. He wasn't ready for that yet, but recognition. The boy knew the man was thinking through problems methodically, using tools and knowledge the way Richard used market analysis and risk assessment in boardrooms. Maybe farming wasn't the waste Richard had assumed it was. Maybe there was real thinking required here, real skill beyond what money could purchase. He kept his arms crossed, but leaned forward slightly, interested despite his earlier dismissal. The John Deere's dashboard completed its update. New interface elements appeared on the touchscreen. Competition mode active, traction management, maximum aggression, torque distribution dynamic real-time. The machine had transformed from agricultural workhorse to precision instrument calibrated for this exact moment on this exact ground. Marcus climbed back into the cab. The air conditioning had kept the interior cool, insulated from the July heat pressing down on everyone outside. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, checked the mirrors, glanced at the rearview camera showing the chain connection point. Everything optimal, everything ready. He looked across the pull lane at Walter, still sitting motionless on that iron seat, and felt a strange mix of respect and determination. The old man had earned the first draw, but that was all he'd get. The flag dropped, and Marcus engaged the drivetrain differently this time. Not the instant explosion of power from round one, but a graduated application. 40%, the computer read ground resistance, 60%, traction holding, 80%, wheels gripping with calculated precision, 100%, the full force of 620 horses, distributed exactly where sensors determined grip was strongest. The system was reading the ground 200 times per second, making micro-adjustments no human operator could manage, finding traction in places Marcus couldn't see and wouldn't have known to look for. The chain pulled taut with less violence than before, but more certainty. The case began moving backward immediately. 1 foot. Walter opened his steam regulator. 2 feet. Walter pushed to 75% throttle. 3 feet. The boiler pressure climbed toward the upper edge of safe range, the needle creeping past the mark Walter normally kept it under. 150 psi, 165, 170. The red line at 180 loomed close, representing the maximum stress those century-old seals could handle before catastrophic failure became not just possible, but likely. The iron wheels fought it for purchase on ground that had been packed hard by 3 weeks without rain. The lug cleats threw small sprays of dirt as they struggled, iron scraping against earth that refused to yield. Walter's left hand stayed on the main pressure valve, his right on the regulator, both working in coordination born from 40 years of practice. But the ground was working against him now. The dry surface near the center line gave rubber tires better purchase than iron cleats could find. Physics was doing Marcus's work for him, converting power into movement with the ruthless efficiency of properly applied force. Walter's jaw clenched. First sign of strain showing on his face. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the decades of experience that had taught him how to stay calm when machines pushed toward their limits. The iron seat rattled violently beneath him. The whole frame shook with effort, but the backward movement continued, 4 feet past center. Donald Morrison moved into position with his measuring tape, already knowing what the result would be, but needing to make it official. The center flag crossed the line 2 feet past neutral, dragging toward Walter's side of the pull lane. Donald raised his hand toward Marcus. Round 2, Kendall. The crowd on Marcus's side erupted with the released tension of people who'd started to doubt, and now felt vindicated. Phones recorded the moment. Someone near the far rail cupped hands around their mouth and shouted loud enough to carry across the entire fairground. "Send that rust bucket back to the museum where it belongs," laughter followed. Not universal, but enough to sting. The younger farmers nodded to each other, their faith in technology and progress and the forward march of civilization restored. Richard Kendall allowed himself a small smile, not satisfaction, but acknowledgement. 1 round left. 1 round to finish what should have been finished in the first pull. Marcus climbed down from the cab, and Brandon met him with an outstretched hand. They clasped forearms, the kind of celebration that stays controlled because the job isn't finished yet. Stephen was already reviewing footage on his phone, marking the exact moment when the case's backward movement became irreversible. Competition mode worked perfectly. "Look at this torque curve, smooth optimized, exactly what we needed." Marcus nodded, but his attention had already shifted to the final round. His father was watching. That changed everything. Changed the weight of winning. Changed what failure would mean. He walked toward Richard, trying to read something in that carefully neutral expression. "Better. 1 more." That was all Richard said. 2 words. But they carried the accumulated weight of 31 years of being measured against standards Marcus could never quite reach. He turned back toward the John Deere without responding, throat too tight for words that wouldn't sound defensive or desperate, or like he was still trying to prove something he should have proven years ago. The crowd on Walter's side had gone quiet. Not defeated exactly, but the kind of quiet that settles over people when hope starts requiring faith instead of evidence. Pamela Morrison looked at Donald with worry etched across her features. Can he come back from this? Donald didn't answer immediately. He'd seen Walter pull off impossible things before, but never against these odds, never with this much at stake. He touched Pamela's shoulder gently. If anyone can, it's him. But his voice lacked the conviction his words tried to convey. Timothy Brennan stood near the oak tree lemonade forgotten in his hand, watching Walter lose and thinking about foreclosure notices and bank board meetings and the difference between what's legal and what's right. The math didn't care about courage. The math didn't care that Walter Hayes had kept every promise he'd ever made. The math only cared about dollars and debt and the timeline that ended Monday morning. Rebecca Hayes stood in the back of the crowd, hidden behind taller people, one hand pressed against her mouth to keep sounds from escaping. She'd watched her father lose round 2 and felt the defeat like a physical blow. All those arguments over the phone about selling the farm, about moving on, about letting go of the past and embracing a future that didn't involve so much struggle, all of it seemed cruel now. She'd been asking him to surrender the only thing that gave his life meaning. She'd been asking him to break promises to people who couldn't speak anymore, but whose words still mattered. The guilt was crushing. Pamela had positioned herself near Rebecca, offering silent support, not pushing conversation. They watched Walter climb down from the case, moving slower than before. 73 years and a lifetime of hard work had accumulated in his joints, his back, his knees that remembered every fall and every long day spent on unforgiving ground. He walked to the rear wheel and knelt again, pressing his hand flat against the earth. "What's he doing?" Rebecca's question came out barely above a whisper. Pamela answered quietly, "Listening to something the rest of us can't hear." Walter held his hand against the ground for 30 seconds, moved it 6 inches, left pressed again, moved it 6 inches forward, repeated the process. 90 seconds total of communion with soil through skin and bone and nerve endings, trained across 5 decades to feel things instruments couldn't measure. He was reading texture density, the structure of earth beneath the baked surface. Most importantly, he was feeling for moisture. The rain had come 4 days ago. Thursday evening, a brief storm that dropped half an inch and then moved east. Most of it had evaporated in the July heat. But water doesn't just disappear. It percolates down, moving through soil particles, seeking the path of least resistance until it hits clay or bedrock or some other barrier that stops its descent. Walter's fingers found it, 6 inches below the surface. Maybe 7, there was moisture. Not much, but enough. Enough to change everything if he could reach it. He stood, brushed dirt from his hand, and walked to his toolbox. The hinges squeaked 40 years of use, without oil, because some sounds become comfort instead of annoyance. He reached inside and pulled out the wrench. Hand-forged steel, curved handle, worn smooth not by time alone, but by 3 generations of hands gripping it in moments when nothing else would suffice. The metal was dark with age and oil and history. Walter moved to the rear differential housing. The adjustment he needed to make was simple in execution, but profound in implication. 1/4 turn clockwise on the lock pin. The differential, which normally allowed the rear wheels to turn at different speeds for steering and maneuverability, would lock. Both wheels would be forced to turn at exactly the same rate. No slippage between them. No loss of power to differential gears designed for flexibility. 100% of available torque distributed equally to both wheels simultaneously. He fitted the wrench onto the pin and applied pressure. The mechanism resisted. It hadn't been locked in 3 years, not since the last time Walter had faced ground conditions that demanded everything the machine could give. The wrench turned, 1/4 rotation. The lock engaged with a solid click that spoke of precision engineering from an era when tolerances were measured by craftsmen's hands instead of computer-controlled machines. Several of the older farmers near Walter's end of the lane straightened up. They recognized what they'd just witnessed. A man near the front whispered to his wife, "Haven't seen anyone use a mechanical diff lock in 30 years." His wife looked confused. "What's it do? Makes both rear wheels pull together. No power wasted. Old school solution to a problem these new machines solve with computers." He paused, watching Walter close the toolbox and prepare to climb back onto the case. Difference is, computers react after wheels start slipping. A mechanical lock prevents the slip from starting at all. Walter secured the wrench in its designated spot, the curved handle fitting into worn grooves in the toolbox, foam padding like a key in its lock. He walked around the case one more time, checking chain tension, examining the boiler gauge, ensuring steam pressure had settled to 150 psi after the stress of round 2. Everything was as ready as human hands could make it. But ready wasn't the same as sufficient. Ready just meant you'd done your part. Whether that was enough depended on factors beyond preparation and skill and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations. He touched the yellowed tape beside the pressure gauge. His father's handwriting faded but legible across 37 years, only when it matters. Below it, his own addition from last night, for Patricia, for the land. The words anchored him to something larger than personal victory or defeat. This wasn't about pride. This was about keeping faith with people who'd trusted him to protect what they'd built together. The memory came unbidden. Spring of 1987. Walter had been 36 years old, not yet the man he'd become, but no longer the boy who'd left for the state university, thinking education would give him choices beyond the farm. He'd returned after 2 years, having learned that choices without purpose are just distractions. The farm was his purpose. Robert Hayes had been 62, still strong, but beginning to slow in ways he tried to hide from everyone except his son. They'd been in the barn late afternoon sunlight, slanting through gaps in the wooden walls, dust motes floating in golden columns of light. The case. 1914 sat between them. Walter's grandfather, William, had bought it in 1947. Used but functional, a machine that had already seen 32 years of service and would see 40 more if treated with respect. Robert held the same wrench Walter now carried in his toolbox. "Son, come here. Time you learned what your grandfather taught me." Young Walter had approached, wiping oil from his hands onto a rag, curious about the seriousness in his father's voice. Robert pointed to the differential housing. "See this? Most days you leave it unlocked. Wheels turn independent. Helps with steering, saves wear on the mechanism. So why would you lock it?" Robert handed him the wrench, letting him feel the weight, the curve worn by his grandfather's hands across decades of use. "Feel that? That's from 60 years of the same grip, same motion. Your grandfather William wore that curve from 1920 until he died in 1986. Every time he used it, he knew this is the moment that matters." The young Walter had turned the wrench over, examining the wear patterns, trying to understand what made one moment different from another. What moment Robert walked to the pressure gauge panel, touched the strip of red tape he'd installed years earlier when the boiler had been reconditioned. The moment when everything you've got needs to go into the ground. Not 90%, not 95, everything. He pulled a pencil from his shirt pocket, licked the tip, and wrote on the tape in careful block letters, "Only when it matters. How do I know when it matters?" Robert looked at him with the intensity of a man passing down knowledge that couldn't be found in manuals or textbooks or the Agricultural Extension Office's quarterly bulletins. "You'll know, son. The day comes when losing means losing more than a competition, when it means losing who you are, when the promises you made start weighing more than the machine you're sitting on." Young Walter had nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting that comprehension would come with time and experience, and the accumulated weight of years spent keeping faith with land and family and the people who depended on him to protect what they'd built together. "What if I use it wrong?" Then you learn, but don't be afraid to use it at all. Machines like this, they're built to give everything when asked. Respect that, and they'll never let you down. Fear it, and you'll never know what you're truly capable of when the moment demands it. Robert had shown him how to engage the lock, how to feel the mechanism click into place, how to recognize the subtle change in the machine's behavior when both wheels worked as one. They'd practiced on easier ground, building Walter's confidence, teaching him to trust the machine and himself in equal measure. When Robert had deemed the lesson complete, he'd made Walter promise. "This stays between us and the ground. You use this when you need it, not to show off. Understood, understood." The memory faded, and Walter stood in the July heat of 2024, that same wrench secured in the toolbox, that same promise written on yellowed tape beside the pressure gauge. Robert had been dead for 26 years. William had been gone for 38. But their hands had shaped this moment as surely as Walter's hands gripped the iron throttle. 3 generations of knowledge compressed into 1/4 turn of a hand-forged wrench, and the faith that when the moment came, the machine would give everything it had if asked correctly. Marcus watched from across the pull lane, studying Walter's movements, trying to decode meaning from actions he didn't fully understand. Brandon noticed his attention. "Boss, what's he doing now?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever it is, he believes it'll work." Stephen zoomed in with his phone camera, capturing Walter's face, the calm concentration, the absence of panic or doubt, or the desperate energy of someone trying to force an outcome through will alone. "Should we adjust our strategy?" Marcus considered. They'd already optimized everything the John Deere could optimize. Tire pressure was perfect for surface conditions. Competition mode was active. Torque distribution was maximized. What else could they change? He was fighting with every advantage technology and money could provide. Walter was fighting with knowledge passed down through generations and promises made to dead men. Which would prove stronger, Marcus genuinely didn't know anymore. Richard Kendall had been watching the same scene. Jonathan Wright leaned close. Old man's running out of options. Richard didn't respond immediately. He'd spent 30 years in business watching people fight losing battles with dignity, watching them employ every trick and tactic they knew before finally accepting inevitable defeat. Walter Hayes didn't look like a man accepting defeat. He looked like someone preparing to deploy a weapon he'd been saving for exactly this circumstance. Richard felt a flicker of something he rarely experienced: uncertainty about an outcome he'd assumed was predetermined. Rebecca had moved closer to the front of the crowd, drawn by magnetic pull toward her father, despite Pamela's gentle suggestion to wait. She could see his face now, across the distance. Saw the calm she'd mistaken for stubbornness during all those phone calls about selling the farm. Saw the determination she'd interpreted as inability to let go of the past. Saw clearly, for maybe the first time in her adult life, that her father wasn't clinging to something because he couldn't imagine alternatives. He was protecting something because alternatives meant breaking faith with people who'd trusted him to carry forward what they'd begun. The guilt intensified. Every argument she'd made about retirement and enjoying life and letting go of burdens had been asking him to betray promises he'd rather die keeping. She'd measured his life by her standards, her values, her definition of success and happiness and fulfillment. She'd never asked what gave his life meaning. She'd just assumed he was trapped by the past instead of honored by it. Pamela appeared beside her. "He knows you're here, honey. I saw him look this direction twice." Rebecca's breath caught. "Did he see me?" "Don't think so, but he felt something. Call it father's intuition. Should I not yet? Let him finish this. Then you'll have time for words." The fairground had taken on different energy. The confidence of Marcus's supporters had solidified around the round 2 victory, but an undercurrent of doubt had appeared. The old farmers who'd watched technology triumph over experience too many times to count felt something shifting. They didn't know what Walter had done with that wrench, but they recognized the deliberation, the certainty of movement that comes from knowledge tested across decades. Hope started creeping back into spaces where resignation had begun to settle. Donald Morrison checked his watch. 3:17 p.m. The fair would close at 6. Trophy presentation was scheduled for 4, but timing had become irrelevant. The 300 people gathered around this pull lane weren't thinking about schedules or what came next or when they needed to get home. They were witnessing something that felt larger than entertainment or agricultural competition or even the prize money at stake. Timothy Brennan had moved to a different position closer to the pull lane, unable to stay away, despite knowing that watching wouldn't change Monday's inevitable confrontation. The foreclosure notice in his briefcase seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. He thought about his own father, who'd farmed 80 acres until arthritis forced the sale. Thought about what it means to lose land, not property, not investment, but identity. The ground your grandfather broke, the soil your father improved, the legacy you promised to protect and pass forward. Money couldn't measure that kind of loss. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to the bank's board chairman. Request emergency meeting Monday, 8 a.m. Hayes foreclosure. Need to discuss terms. He hesitated, finger hovering over send. This could cost him his job. The board had voted. Policy was clear. Exceptions created precedent, and precedent created chaos in a system built on consistent application of rules, regardless of personal circumstances. But watching Walter Hayes refuse to quit on that ancient machine while facing odds, no reasonable person would accept something about it, demanded a witness, demanded recognition, demanded someone with power, say that courage counted for something even when arithmetic said otherwise. He pressed send. Marcus had climbed back into the John Deere's cab. The air conditioning hummed, maintaining perfect interior climate, while outside the temperature pushed 97 degrees. He ran through final system checks. Every readout showed optimal. He'd done everything right. Applied knowledge used tools, made data-driven decisions. This was what modern agriculture looked like. Precision, efficiency, measurable outcomes. He glanced across the lane one more time at Walter sitting motionless on that iron seat, hands resting on his knees, looking toward some distant point beyond the fairground's boundaries. That calm unsettled Marcus more than panic would have. Panic he understood. Panic was human, relatable, the natural response when faced with the impossible odds. But Walter's stillness suggested something else. Suggested he knew something Marcus didn't. Suggested the equation wasn't as simple as horsepower versus history. Marcus felt the first real doubt creep into his certainty. Not about the machine the John Deere would perform exactly as designed, but about whether performance alone determined outcomes when human will enter the calculation. Brandon approached the driver's side window. "Ready when you are, boss. All systems optimal." Marcus nodded but didn't speak. His father was watching. 300 strangers were watching. But more importantly, he was watching himself in this moment, seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time, that winning here wouldn't prove what he'd thought it would prove. Wouldn't validate his choice to farm instead of joining the pharmaceutical company. Wouldn't earn Richard's approval or respect or even acknowledgement that Marcus had made valid decisions about his own life. Victory would just be victory. An old man on an old machine would go home defeated, and Marcus would have a trophy he didn't need and prize money that meant nothing except confirmation that spending enough money on equipment could overcome most obstacles. The realization should have been liberating. Instead, it left him feeling hollow. Walter had climbed back onto the case, settling onto the iron seat with the careful precision of someone whose body had started keeping score of every impact, every jar, every moment of stress applied to joints and spine and knees that had accumulated 73 years of wear. He adjusted his position slightly, finding the sweet spot where the seat's contours matched his frame. Then he reached forward to the pressure gauge panel. The valve he'd never touched during rounds 1 and 2 sat beside the main regulator. Red tape marked it clearly. Beside that tape, the yellowed note, "Only when it matters," and below in fresh ink, "For Patricia, for the land." His right hand moved to that valve, but didn't open it yet. This was the weapon Robert had shown him in 1987. The direct steam feed that bypassed all regulation, sending maximum boiler pressure straight to the pistons without the governing mechanisms designed to protect century-old seals from catastrophic failure. He could use it once per day, maybe twice if the boiler was new and the seals were fresh. But this boiler was from 1915, and the seals had been replaced in 1997, and they had exactly one good push left in them before the risk of rupture became unacceptable. Walter looked at the pressure gauge. 150 psi. Good baseline. When he opened the red valve, it would climb to 177, maybe 178 if he pushed it. 3 psi below the red line that represented the threshold where steam engine became potential bomb. 3 psi of margin between success and disaster, between keeping promises and breaking them in the most final way possible. His hand stayed on the valve, ready but waiting for Donald Morrison to raise the flag, waiting for the moment when everything he had left would pour into the ground through iron wheels and lug cleats and faith in a machine that had never failed anyone who asked it correctly. The crowd had gone quiet, without anyone calling for silence, just the natural hush that falls when people sense they're about to witness something that will stay with them long after the fairground closes and everyone returns to their separate lives. Marcus sat in his air-conditioned cab with 620 horses waiting for his command. Walter sat on an iron seat under open sky with 45 horses and 3 generations of promises. Between them, a chain. Above them, Donald Morrison with a flag. Everything Walter Hayes loved, his father's memory, his wife's faith, his daughter's future, watching from the shadows, the land that had made him who he was, it all came down to the next 3 minutes. And the only thing standing between him and losing it all was 110 years of cast iron, some steam, and promises he'd made to 3 people who couldn't be there to see if he kept them. Donald raised the flag. Walter climbed down from the case before the flag dropped. The movement caught everyone off guard. Competitors didn't leave their machines between the ready signal and the start. Donald Morrison lowered the flag halfway, confused, checking if there was a mechanical problem that needed attention. But Walter wasn't walking toward his toolbox or inspecting the boiler. He was walking across the pull lane, past the chain lying slack in the dirt, past the white flag marking center, past the invisible boundary that separated his world from Marcus Kendall's. He stopped beside the John Deere's cab. Marcus saw him through the windshield, this 73-year-old man in a flannel shirt, standing in the dust beside a machine that cost more than most houses. Marcus opened the door, looking down from the elevated cab, uncertain what protocol covered this situation. Walter looked up, meeting his eyes directly, and extended his right hand. "That's a fine machine you've got there, son. You run it well." The words carried no edge, no strategy, no performance, for the crowd pressed against the rails. Just a plain statement from one person to another before something hard was about to happen between them. "Your father must be proud." Marcus stared for 4 full seconds. Nobody had ever, not professors, not business associates, not his father himself, acknowledged his farming with that kind of simple respect. Everyone had opinions about his choice judgments, about whether it made sense, analyses of risk versus reward. But this old man facing impossible odds had just given him something rarer than approval: recognition. Marcus reached down and took Walter's hand. The grip was firm, calloused, warm. Decades of work transmitted through that brief contact. When Walter released and turned to walk back across the pull lane, Marcus could still feel the residual heat in his palm. The crowd had gone completely silent. Not the electric anticipation before a competition, but something deeper. The kind of quiet that settles when people witness honor expressed without words elaborate enough to dilute it. Rebecca Hayes stood in the back with her hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her face without sound. She'd spent 6 months arguing with her father from Chicago, trying to convince him to abandon the farm, to give up, to accept defeat gracefully. And here he was, facing certain loss, taking time to acknowledge the worth of the man about to beat him. "That's my dad." The whisper escaped before she could stop it. Pamela Morrison squeezed her shoulder, too overcome to speak. Richard Kendall had uncrossed his arms for the first time since arriving. Jonathan Wright looked at him. What was that about? Richard watched Walter climb back onto the case, settling onto the iron seat with the same calm he'd shown since 5:30 that morning. Respect. For what? For Tring, for showing up, for fighting, even when the outcome seems predetermined. Richard's voice carried something Jonathan had rarely heard in 30 years of working together. Not quite emotion, but close. Something that acknowledged human effort beyond measurable results and quarterly earnings and the cold arithmetic that governed their professional lives. Marcus sat in the John Deere's cab with his hand still warm from Walter's grip, trying to process what had just happened. That handshake had shifted something fundamental. He'd been treating this pull as validation, as proof that his choices were correct, as ammunition against every doubt his father had expressed about farming versus corporate success. But Walter had just reminded him that the man across the chain mattered more than the competition between them, that regardless of who won or lost, they were both fighting for something larger than trophies or prize money or proving skeptics wrong. Brandon approached the window. "Boss, you okay?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm okay." But he wasn't sure that was true. Something had cracked in his certainty. Not about winning, he still believed the John Deere would triumph, but about what that victory would mean and whether it was the victory he actually wanted. Walter had returned to the case and was reaching for the pressure gauge panel. His hand moved to the valve he'd kept in reserve for 90 minutes while the crowd watched and doubted and made assumptions about inevitable outcomes. The red tape marking it had faded, but the message remained clear. Only when it matters. His father's handwriting from 1987, when Robert Hayes had been 62 years old and still strong enough to believe his son would need this knowledge someday. Below that, Walter's own addition from the night before, for Patricia, for the land. He opened the valve. Quarter-turn counterclockwise smooth rotation despite 37 years of mostly staying closed. The boiler responded immediately. The sound changed from the steady rhythm they had heard all morning to something deeper, more urgent. Steam pressure that had been regulated and controlled and kept safely below stress points now had direct access to the pistons. No governor, no safety mechanism beyond Walter's judgment and the faith that century-old seals would hold one more time when asked to give everything they had. The needle on the pressure gauge began to climb. 150 psi, 160, 170. Walter's right hand stayed on the valve, making micro-adjustments, feeling the machine's response through vibrations in the iron seat, through the sound of steam moving through pipes, through knowledge accumulated across 4 decades of listening to what this particular engine needed in any given moment. 175, 177. The red line at 180 marked the threshold where steam pressure exceeded the rated capacity of seals installed in 1997 when the boiler had been reconditioned. Beyond that line, rupture became not theoretical risk, but probable outcome. Walter held the pressure at 177 pounds per square inch, 3 pounds below catastrophic failure. 3 pounds of margin between keeping promises and breaking them forever. Donald Morrison raised the flag one more time. His hand trembled slightly, not from age or weakness, but from understanding what he was about to witness. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a man betting everything he had on machinery and faith and promises made to people who couldn't see whether he kept them. Donald looked at Walter, caught his eye, received a single nod. Then he looked at Marcos, saw the young man's face tight with concentration and something else that might have been conflict. The flag reached its apex. Winner takes all. The flag dropped, and Marcos didn't wait. The John Deere's throttle hit full power instantly. Every optimization, every adjustment, every advantage money and technology could provide, all directed toward pulling an old man on an old machine across 10 feet of Tennessee dirt. The diesel engine exploded into maximum output. Turbochargers, screaming electronic traction management, distributing 620 horses with computer precision to the exact patches of ground where sensors detected optimal grip. The sound was massive. Not a roar, but a wall of force that made the air feel heavier, that vibrated in people's chests 30 yards away, that sent children covering their ears, and adults leaning back instinctively from the rails. Black exhaust punched skyward from the vertical stack. The 42-inch rear tires, pressurized 8 pounds beyond standard, compressed and then bit into the packed surface with everything modern engineering had learned about converting power into movement. The chain went from slack to rigid in 0.3 seconds. The crack of 80 feet of iron links, snapping taut, echoed off every building in the fairground. Conversations a quarter-mile away stopped mid-sentence. The horses in the livestock barn shifted nervously in their stalls. A flock of starlings lifted from the oak trees along the eastern fence, startled into flight by something their instincts read as danger. The case shuddered under the impact. The iron frame flexed, metal stressed beyond normal operating parameters. Century-old welds tested against forces they'd been designed to handle, but never for extended duration. The rear wheels pressed hard into the ground, lug cleats seeking purchase, fighting against 620 horses, trying to drag 12,500 pounds backward through dirt that had been baked hard by 3 weeks of July sun and no rain. Walter's right hand stayed on the red valve. His left opened the main throttle to 100%. Full steam, full pressure, full commitment. The boiler exhaled with a deep pulse that resonated in the same frequency as human heartbeats. The flywheel spun up to 180 revolutions per minute. The drive chains pulled taut with mechanical inevitability. And the combination of three elements Walter had put in place began to work exactly as he'd calculated they would work when he knelt in the dirt between rounds, reading soil with his bare hands. The locked differential meant both rear wheels turned at precisely the same speed. No slippage between them, no power lost to gears designed for flexibility and steering. 100% of available torque distributed equally to both wheels simultaneously. Electronic traction control on the John Deere could achieve similar results, but electronics reacted after sensing wheel slip. The mechanical lock prevented slip from ever starting. It was the difference between responding to a problem and eliminating the problem before it could exist. The red valve feeding maximum steam pressure meant the case was producing every pound of force the boiler could generate without safety regulation. The pistons received direct pressure, converting thermal energy to mechanical work with the ruthless efficiency of physics understood and applied correctly. 45 horsepower was rated capacity under normal operation, but normal operation built in safety margins, governor restrictions limits designed to extend machine life across decades of regular use. Remove those limits and the case could produce closer to 60 horses for short duration before components began failing from stress. Not enough to match 620 on paper, but enough to change the calculation when combined with advantages the John Deere couldn't replicate. The iron lug cleats were 6 inches tall, narrow-pointed, designed to concentrate weight into small surface area and punch through packed earth into the substrate below. Walter's hand reading had found moisture at that depth water from Thursday's brief storm that had percolated down, seeking clay layer beneath the topsoil, trapped there, waiting for something to reach it. Rubber tires, no matter how perfectly pressurized, spread load across wide contact patch. They stayed on the surface, gripping what was available, limited by physics, to the traction dry dust and packed dirt could provide. Iron cleats punched through. The backward movement stopped. 6 inches from where the pull began, the case's wheels found that moisture layer and bit down with the concentrated force of 12,000 pounds distributed across narrow points. The chemical bond between iron and clay, mixed with water, exceeded the friction coefficient of rubber against dry surface. The wheels held. The chain stretched, but didn't move. Both machines locked in perfect equilibrium for 2.7 seconds that felt like suspension of time itself. Then the chain changed direction. Not dramatically, not with the violence of round one's initial engagement, just a subtle shift, one link of movement, then another. The center flag began its slow migration away from Walter toward Marcus. Inch by inch, the case, pulling the John Deere backward despite every law of engineering that said this outcome was impossible. Marcus saw it happening through the windshield and pushed the throttle harder, forgetting it was already at maximum, forgetting the computer was already doing everything it could do, forgetting that sometimes the right answer isn't more of what you've been doing, but something different you haven't thought of yet. The dashboard began flashing warnings. Tire slip 15%, 20%, 25%, traction loss critical. The computer's recommendation appeared on screen. Reduce throttle to regain control. Marcus ignored it, kept full power engaged, refused to accept what the data was telling him. The John Deere's front wheels lifted slightly off the ground. The machine's weight shifted rearward under the force of trying to resist backward motion while maintaining forward thrust. The rear tires spun against packed surface, finding nothing to hold, throwing dust and small stones, computer cycling through every adjustment it knew how to make, while physics worked against solutions that required the ground to cooperate in ways it had decided not to. 1 foot past center toward Marcus, 2 feet. The crowd on Walter's side began to stand, to lean forward, to believe in something they'd dismissed 90 minutes ago as nostalgic fantasy. 3 feet. Richard Kendall's hands gripped the rail in front of him, knuckles white, watching his son lose and feeling something unexpected that wasn't disappointment. 4 feet. Rebecca couldn't see anymore through tears that blurred everything except the outline of her father on that iron seat, his hands steady on the controls, his body perfectly still, giving the machine everything it needed and nothing it didn't. 5 feet. Donald Morrison moved into position with his measuring tape, hardly believing what he was witnessing, but knowing his duty required documenting it regardless of improbability. 6 feet. Timothy Brennan stood under the oak tree with his phone in his hand, looking at the message he'd sent to the bank's board chairman, knowing he'd just committed to a fight that might cost him his career, but unable to care about that while watching a 73-year-old man refuse to let arithmetic determine outcomes. 7 feet. Marcus could feel it ending, feel the John Deere losing purchase, losing ground, losing the competition, despite every advantage except the one that mattered, understanding of soil and moisture, and the knowledge of when to apply force and when to apply faith. 8 feet. Brandon and Stephen had stopped recording, just watching, mouths open, trying to process what their data said couldn't happen but was happening anyway. 9 feet. Walter's face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, no emotion beyond concentration on maintaining the exact pressure and throttle position that had worked for 9 feet and needed to work for 1 more. His right hand made one final micro-adjustment to the red valve. Pressure at 177.5 psi. Half a pound below the maximum he'd allowed himself, but the boiler was starting to shake, starting to show stress in ways that told him the seals had given everything they could give, and 1 more push would take them past the point where coming back was possible. 10 feet! Donald Morrison raised the red flag toward Walter. His voice cracked when he tried to speak into the megaphone. Round 3. Hayes! Walter closed the red valve immediately. The pressure began dropping 177 to 165 to 150, returning to safe operating range with the same care he'd used bringing it up. He eased the main throttle back to 50%, letting the machine settle, cooling the systems that had been stressed beyond their design limits, showing the case the same respect it had just shown him by giving everything it had without failing in the moment when failure would have meant more than mechanical breakdown. 3 seconds of absolute silence followed Donald's announcement. Not a single person in 300 moved or breathed or made sound. The kind of silence that exists in the moment after lightning strike, after car crash, after anything that reorganizes reality and requires human brains to process new information that contradicts everything they'd assumed was true. Then the roar came from every direction simultaneously, from Marcus's supporters who recognized greatness regardless of which side it appeared on, from Walter's people who'd never stopped believing but had started to doubt, from the neutral observers who'd come for entertainment and received something closer to revelation, from children who didn't understand the technical details but knew they'd witnessed something rare, from older farmers who did understand and had just watched knowledge defeat technology in the same way knowledge had been defeating technology since the first human figured out that understanding trumps force when applied correctly. The sound shook the wooden rails. It rolled across the fairground like summer thunder. It reached the parking areas and the concession stands and the exhibit halls where other competitions were happening. People abandoned those events, drawn by the noise, wanting to know what had created sound that profound from human throats. Rebecca broke from the crowd and ran across the viewing area, ducked under the rail, sprinted across the pull lane toward her father, who was still sitting on the case, making final adjustments to the boiler, ensuring the machine that had just saved his farm would survive the stress it had endured. She reached the rear wheel, breathing hard, and called up to him. "Dad!" Walter turned, saw his daughter for the first time in 6 months, saw her professional clothes dusty from travel and running, saw tears on her face, saw something in her expression that looked like the girl she'd been at 16 before law school and Chicago, and career ambitions had created distance between them. He climbed down slowly, knees protesting back tight from 90 minutes of absorbing vibration through an iron seat, moving like a man who'd just spent everything he had and was running on fumes and promises. "Rebecca, honey, you drove. I couldn't miss this." The words came out broken by sobs she wasn't trying to control anymore. They stood 3 feet apart in the dirt beside a steam tractor, father and daughter, separated by time and choices and arguments about farms and futures and what mattered more than what. Then Rebecca closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him, holding tight, trying to communicate through embrace. What words hadn't managed to convey across 6 months of silence. Walter returned the hug carefully, still not quite believing she was there, that she'd canceled whatever was happening in Chicago to drive 8 hours through the night to stand in Tennessee dirt while he fought for land she'd spent months telling him to sell. His voice came out rough. "Your mother would have loved to see you here." Rebecca pulled back just enough to look at his face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? For not understanding, for telling you to sell, for not being here when you needed me." Walter's hand found her cheek thumb, brushing away tears that kept coming despite her best efforts to stop them. "You're here now. That's all that matters. I want to come home, Dad. Not visit. Come home." His throat closed. Too many emotions hitting simultaneously, relief and joy and grief for Patricia, who wasn't here to see this moment, and gratitude that Rebecca had found her way back before it was too late. He managed a nod, unable to trust his voice. They stood together in the aftermath, while the crowd continued celebrating, while Marcus sat alone in his cab, processing what had happened, while judges conferred, and Donald Morrison prepared to make the official announcement everyone already knew. Pamela Morrison had followed Rebecca at a slower pace, giving them privacy for the reunion, but needing to be close to them both. She reached them and put one hand on Walter's shoulder. "Patricia's looking down right now, Walter, smiling at both of you." Walter nodded again, still unable to speak. Donald approached with the megaphone but lowered it, seeing this wasn't the moment for official pronouncements. Some things needed space before ceremony could happen. He stepped back and let the Hayes family have their moment in the Tennessee heat while history rearranged itself around them. Marcus had climbed down from the John Deere. Brandon and Stephen hung back, uncertain what their role was in this outcome nobody had predicted. Richard Kendall was walking across the viewing area toward his son, expression unreadable, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Here it came, the disappointment, the "I told you so," the confirmation that farming had been the wrong choice and corporate success was the only path Richard would ever respect. Richard stopped in front of him, extended his hand. Marcus stared at it, confused, until Richard spoke. "Well fought, son." The words didn't match anything Marcus had expected. "Dad, I lost. You fought with honor." You shook his hand before the pull. You gave everything the machine could give. You adapted between rounds. You made thoughtful decisions under pressure. Richard's voice carried weight Marcus had never heard directed at him before. Not approval exactly, something deeper. In 30 years of business, I've won plenty of deals, but I've never respected someone the way I just watched you respect that old man. That matters more than any trophy. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. His father had just given him what he'd been fighting for since the day he'd bought the farm, acknowledgement that this path had worth, that the choices he'd made meant something beyond rebellion against expectations. "I'm proud of you." 3 words Richard Kendall had never said to his son in 31 years. Marcus's eyes stung, but he refused to let tears fall in front of 300 people. Richard's hand was still extended. Marcus took it, and his father pulled him into a brief, awkward embrace that communicated decades of distance starting to close. "Now go talk to him. Learn from him." Richard released Marcus and turned back toward Jonathan Wright, who'd been watching with the bemused expression of someone witnessing emotions he didn't quite understand, but recognized as significant. Marcus stood alone for a moment, processing, then walked across the pull lane toward Walter Hayes. Walter had separated from Rebecca and Pamela, giving them space to talk while he made final checks on the case. The boiler was settling properly, pressure down to 140 PS1 and dropping toward safe rest levels. The drive chains were intact. The locked differential needed to be disengaged before he moved the machine again. He was reaching for his toolbox when Marcus appeared beside the right rear wheel. How? Just that word. No frustration, no argument. Pure question from someone who'd brought every advantage and watched them prove insufficient. Walter straightened up, toolbox in hand, and looked at the young man who'd shaken his hand before the final round, despite every reason to see him as just an obstacle. "She doesn't fight the ground, son. She works with it, always has." He pointed to the lug cleats packed with dark, moist soil from 6 inches below the surface. "See, that's from the layer your tires never reached. Thursday's rain percolated down, got trapped by clay. My cleats could punch through to it. Yours couldn't." Marcus knelt, studying the soil. Seeing it clearly for the first time, the difference between surface conditions his sensors had measured and substrate conditions only hands pressed against earth could detect. Walter continued, gesturing to the differential housing. "That lock means both wheels pull together. No slippage. Your computer does the same thing electronically, but electronics react after slip starts. Mechanics prevent the slip from existing." He tapped the pressure gauge panel, the red tape, the yellowed note. And this 110 years of engineers learning how to make steam give everything it's got exactly when you ask. But you can only ask once. Any more, and he gestured to the boiler, implying consequences he didn't need to make explicit. Marcus absorbed it all, seeing clearly that he'd been fighting with power, while Walter had been fighting with understanding. That data and sensors and computer optimization mattered, but they built on foundation of knowing, truly knowing what the ground would do and what the machine could give, and when the moment demanded, asking for everything. "Would you teach me?" The question surprised them both. Marcus hadn't planned to ask. Walter hadn't expected to be asked. They stood in the July heat, surrounded by crowd noise and celebration, and the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, and something passed between them that wasn't quite friendship yet, but might become it given time. "Your father raised a good man. Bring him if he's willing. I'll show you both what Robert Hayes taught me." Marcus nodded, throat too tight for words that wouldn't sound inadequate anyway. He reached out to touch the case's iron wheel, feeling residual warmth from the pull, trying to understand, through contact, what words couldn't fully convey. 3 generations of knowledge compressed into metal and steam, and promises kept across decades. He'd tried to win with money. Walter had won with memory. The difference was everything. Donald Morrison finally raised the megaphone, giving the moment enough space to breathe before official duties required his attention. "Folks, if I can have your attention, we have a result." The crowd quieted, gradually, reluctant to let celebration end, but curious about what came next. Donald's voice carried across the fairground with the practiced projection of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, but never quite like this. Winner by 2 rounds to 1, Walter Hayes. 1915. Case steam tractor. The roar returned, sustained this time, rolling on for 30 seconds while Walter stood beside his machine, looking uncomfortable with attention while Rebecca wiped tears and held Pamela's hand while Timothy Brennan pulled the foreclosure notice from his briefcase and tore it into pieces, small enough that reassembly would be impossible. The bank board could fire him Monday. Some things mattered more than employment. Trophy presentation at 4 o'clock main stage. Prize money will be awarded at that time. Donald lowered the megaphone and walked to Walter, hand extended. "Hell of a pull, Walt. Your father would have been proud." Walter took his hand, squeezed once. "Thanks, Don. Couldn't have done it without what he taught me. You think you could teach it?" Walter looked at Marcus, who was still standing beside the case, studying the differential lock with the focused intensity of someone determined to understand. "Reckon I could try." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctant to leave, wanting to stretch the moment as long as possible. Children climbed the fence rails for final looks at the steam tractor that had beaten the modern machine. Older farmers gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed, confirming details with each other, making sure memory would preserve this accurately. Younger farmers stood quieter than before. Assumptions challenged certainty. Shaken minds opening to the possibility that new wasn't always better and old wasn't always obsolete. Rebecca found her way back to Walter's side. "Dad, I need to tell you something." He waited patient, giving her space to find the words. "I got a partnership offer in Chicago. It's what I've been working toward for 10 years. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes dimmed slightly. "That's wonderful, honey. Your mother would be so proud." Rebecca shook her head. "I'm turning it down." Walter's breath caught. "Rebecca, I want to come home, Dad. Set up practice here in Cumberland County. Be close to what matters. But your career, I've got a career. What I don't have is family close enough to matter when it counts. I watched you fight today for something that would have been easier to let go. I want to fight for something that matters too." Walter pulled her close again, unable to speak past the emotion blocking his throat. Pamela watched from a respectful distance, remembering Patricia's voice from years ago. She'll come back when she's ready. You can't force it. Just love her and wait." Patricia had been right as usual. The afternoon sun had shifted lower, stretching shadows across the fairground. The temperature remained oppressive, but nobody seemed to notice anymore. Marcus helped Brandon and Stephen secure the John Deere for transport, working in comfortable silence, processing defeat in ways that felt less like failure and more like education. Richard Kendall approached, stopping at a distance that allowed conversation without intrusion. "Your mother would have been proud today." It was the first time Richard had mentioned Elizabeth in months. Marcus looked up from the tie-down strap he was securing. "Yeah, not of the result, of how you handled it. She always said winning was easy. Grace was hard." Marcus finished securing the strap and walked over to his father. "I learned more in the last 2 hours than 3 years of farming." Richard nodded slowly. "That's what makes it worth doing. Come on, let's go congratulate him properly." They walked together toward where Walter stood with Rebecca and watching them cross the pull lane. Brandon whispered to Stephen, "Something changed." "Yeah. Question is what?" "Everything. Watch." The fairground had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon. Food vendors were closing down. Families were packing up blankets and coolers. The livestock barn was emptying as owners loaded animals for the drive home. But the pull lane remained crowded with people unwilling to leave, drawn by gravity of what they'd witnessed, wanting to stay connected to this moment before regular life reasserted its claim on their attention. Walter was loading the case back onto his flatbed truck, working methodically through the process he'd done 1,000 times. Rebecca helped, asking questions about chain tension and boiler cooling and how to secure the wheels properly. Her hands got dirty, and she didn't care. She'd spent 6 years learning to be a lawyer. Now she was learning to be a farmer's daughter again, and the difference felt like coming home after being lost. Marcus and Richard approached together. Walter saw them coming and straightened up from checking a tie-down strap. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted to thank you for before." The handshake. Walter wiped his hands on his jeans. "Seemed like the right thing. You drove 3 hours to be here. That deserves respect." Richard extended his hand. Richard Kendall, Marcus's father. Walter took it. Walter Hayes, Rebecca's father. The 2 men stood there, holding a handshake that connected more than just themselves. 2 families, 2 generations, 2 ways of understanding what it meant to work and build and pass something forward. Richard spoke quietly. "I spent 30 years teaching my son that success meant climbing ladders in buildings. You just taught him something I never could. Thank you. Just showed him what my father showed me. Knowledge passes forward if you let it. Would you be willing to show him more? Both of us, actually. We'd pay for your time." Walter shook his head. "Don't want payment, but if you're willing to work, I'm willing to teach. Ground doesn't care about money, only whether you understand it." Richard smiled, genuine expression, not the corporate approximation Marcus had seen his whole life. "When do we start? Come by the farm Monday morning, 6 o'clock. Bring work clothes and empty heads. The land will fill them if you listen." They shook again, sealing something that felt like the beginning of friendship, despite the decades and differences between them. Marcus felt his chest expand with hope that maybe finally his father saw what he'd been trying to show him for 3 years. Not that farming was better than corporate work, but that it mattered in ways quarterly earnings never could. The trophy presentation at 4 o'clock drew more people than the fair had seen in 15 years. The main stage, normally reserved for livestock judging, and pie-eating contests held Donald Morrison, Walter Hayes, and a wooden trophy with bronze plate that meant more than its material components suggested. The crowd pressed close, 400 people, now word having spread through Cumberland County that something extraordinary had happened at the Pull Lane. Donald handed Walter the microphone. Walter held it uncomfortably, not accustomed to public speaking, not comfortable being the center of this much attention. He cleared his throat. "This trophy belongs to 4 people." His voice carried across the fairground, amplified, but still distinctly his own rough, from decades of not using it more than necessary, but clear enough. My grandfather William, who bought this machine in 1947 and taught my father how to run it. My father Robert, who taught me that machines have souls if you listen close enough. My wife Patricia, who believed in keeping promises even when they cost everything. He paused, voice breaking slightly on her name. Rebecca stood in front of the stage, tears streaming again, but smiling through them. And my daughter Rebecca, who drove all night to be here. Because sometimes the people who matter most show up exactly when you need them. He pointed to her in the crowd. The applause started slowly built, gradually became a sustained wave of sound that wrapped around Rebecca like embrace. She couldn't see any more through the tears, but she could feel it, acceptance, recognition, welcome home after years of being away. Walter handed the microphone back to Donald, who announced the prize money amount. $5,000, 3 months of breathing room with the bank. Not a solution, but time to find one. Timothy Brennan wasn't there to see it. He'd left to prepare for Monday's confrontation with the board to explain why he'd unilaterally destroyed a foreclosure notice and recommended 90-day extension for a farmer who'd just proven he could still fight. The cash came in an envelope. Walter folded it carefully, put it in his shirt pocket, felt its weight against his chest like armor against the future. Rebecca appeared beside him on the stage. "Dad, let me help." "With the money, the farm." He shook his head gently. "You being here is help enough. Rest will work itself out. But the bank, already handled, one way or another." He didn't know that was true. Didn't know Timothy had destroyed the foreclosure notice, or that Monday's meeting might end with Walter having more time instead of less. But he'd spent 50 years learning that worry didn't change outcomes. Work did. Faith did. Promises kept did. He'd worry when worry was required. Right now he needed to get his daughter home and show her the farm she'd been avoiding for 6 years. The drive back to Hayes Farm took 20 minutes through Cumberland County backroads that wound between fields, showing stress from drought, but still producing something worth harvesting. Rebecca rode in the passenger seat of the flatbed while Walter drove the case secured on the trailer behind them, rattling over rough pavement. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. Some silences communicate more than words ever could. The farm appeared as the road crested a small hill, 150 acres of rolling Tennessee landhouse from 1952 that Walter and Patricia had remodeled twice, barn from 1947 that had housed the case since William brought it home. The driveway gravel crunched under the truck's tires. Walter parked near the barn, killed the engine, sat for a moment, looking at land his grandfather had broken. His father had improved. He had protected through decades of weather and economics and the slow erosion of family farms across America. Rebecca looked at the house and saw her mother everywhere. The garden Patricia had planted, the porch swing they'd sat on summer evenings, the window where she used to watch for Rebecca's car coming home from school. The weight of absence pressed down hard. Miss her every day. Walter's voice was quiet but steady. "Me too, Dad. She would have liked today. Seeing you here, seeing that boy learn something real. Think I learned something too." Walter looked at her, curious but patient, letting her find her own words. That some promises are worth everything it costs to keep them. He reached over and squeezed her hand once. Then he climbed down to begin the process of unloading the case-putting tools away, securing the farm for night. Rebecca helped relearning the rhythm of this work, remembering muscle memory from teenage years before law school had seemed more important than land. They worked together in the fading light until the barn was organized and the case was settled in its designated spot, and the tools were clean and put away where they belonged. Inside the house, Walter made coffee the way Patricia used to make it, strong, dark, no sugar. They sat at the kitchen table that had hosted 3 generations of Hayes family meals, and Rebecca asked the question she'd been holding since the pull lane. "What happens Monday with the bank?" Walter sipped his coffee, considering how much to share, how much to shield her from. "Don't know yet, but I've got 90 days to figure something out. Today bought time. Time's all anyone gets. What you do with it determines everything else. Let me hire a lawyer. Fight the foreclosure." He shook his head. "Not fighting. Farming. Way I've always done it. Season by season, day by day, trusting the ground to give back what you put into it if you do it right." Rebecca wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. Her father had been farming for 5 decades, using faith and work as primary tools. Legal strategy wouldn't convince him any more than it would convince the soil to produce when it wasn't ready. She switched approaches. Then, teach me to farm. Really farm. Not just help out, but understand it. Walter studied her face, looking for something beyond impulse or guilt or temporary enthusiasm that would fade when the work got hard. "It's not easy, honey. Early mornings, late nights. Weather doesn't negotiate. Crops fail, markets shift. Banks don't care how hard you worked if the numbers don't balance. I know. But I watched you today refuse to quit when everyone said you should. I want to learn that. Not the tractor part, though I want that too, but the part where you keep going when quitting would be easier." Walter's eyes got wet, but he didn't let tears fall, just nodded once decisively. "Tomorrow morning, 5:30. Bring work clothes and questions. Land will teach you if you listen. Deal." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence while darkness settled over Hayes Farm and Tennessee. Stars appeared overhead, like witnesses to promises made and kept and passed forward through generations that understood some things matter more than comfort or convenience or the easier paths everyone else takes. The next morning arrived cool and clear, temperature in the low 60s before the sun would push it back toward the 90s. Rebecca woke at 5, dressed in old jeans and a t-shirt she'd found in her childhood bedroom, made coffee in the kitchen while Walter was already outside checking equipment. She joined him in the barn where he was making notes about fall planting in a ledger he'd kept since 1975. Handwritten entries tracking crop yields, weather patterns, market prices, the accumulated data of 50 years, farming the same ground. At 6:05, a truck pulled into the driveway. Marcus Kendall climbed out, followed by his father Richard. Both wore work clothes that looked new, store-creased, the uniform of people trying to fit into context they hadn't inhabited before. Marcus carried a notebook. Richard carried nothing but curiosity and the tentative hope that he was about to understand something about his son he'd missed for 3 years. Walter met them at the barn door. "You're late," said 6. Marcus checked his watch. 6:07. Sorry, we kidding. Come on. Got a lot to cover before heat makes thinking impossible. He led them into the barn, where the case sat cooling from yesterday's effort, where tools hung on pegboards organized by function and frequency of use, where 3 generations of farming knowledge had accumulated in the arrangement of everything from workbenches to parts bins. Rebecca followed, watching her father transform from trophy winner back into teacher, which was perhaps the role he'd been meant for all along. Walter pulled out a soil sample from the south field. First lesson: this dirt is not the same as that dirt. Every patch has its own character, its own needs. Computer can analyze composition, but can't tell you how it'll behave under stress or what it'll give back if you treat it right. That takes hands, takes time, takes paying attention across seasons until you know the ground better than you know most people. Marcus wrote notes. Richard just listened, watching his son absorb information with the same intensity he'd brought to engineering classes, to business school, to every challenge he'd ever faced. Walter demonstrated how to read soil texture between fingers, how to smell moisture content, how to recognize clay versus loam versus sand. By the way, it held together when compressed. Basic lessons that took minutes to explain, but lifetimes to internalize. They moved outside to the south field, where winter wheat was showing stress from drought but still producing. Walter knelt, pulled up a sample plant, showed them root structure, explained how roots told you what the plant needed that it wasn't getting. Marcus photographed everything with his phone-building reference library. Richard just knelt in the dirt and touched things, reconnecting with Earth in ways his corporate career had eliminated decades ago. At 7:30, Rebecca brought water and sandwiches to the field. The 4 of them sat in the shade of an oak tree while Walter talked about seasonal cycles, about crop rotation, about the patient years required to improve soil quality enough that yields increased naturally without chemical assistance. Marcus asked technical questions. Richard asked philosophical ones. Rebecca asked about Patricia, about what she'd contributed to the farm beyond partnership, about the division of labor between husband and wife that had kept this operation functioning through decades of challenge. The morning stretched into afternoon. They walked fence lines, examined irrigation systems, discussed fall planting strategies. Walter shared knowledge freely, everything Robert had taught him, everything he'd learned through success and failure, everything worth passing forward to people willing to receive it. Marcus's notebook filled with observations. Richard's expression softened from skepticism to respect, to something approaching wonder that this much complexity existed in work he'd dismissed as simple. At 2 o'clock, Walter called a halt. "That's enough for today. Too much information turns into noise. Go home. Think about what you learned. Come back next week if you're still interested." Marcus closed his notebook carefully. "We'll be back." Richard extended his hand to Walter. "Thank you for this, for yesterday, for showing me what I should have seen 3 years ago, just passing forward what was passed to me. Way it's supposed to work." They drove away in Marcus's truck, father and son talking quietly about soil composition and root structures and the difference between knowing facts and understanding systems. Walter watched them go, then turned to Rebecca. "Think they'll actually come back?" Rebecca looked at her father, at the farm spreading out behind him, at everything she'd tried to leave and finally understood was worth keeping. "Yeah, Dad, I think they will." They walked back to the house together, Walter moving slower than he had yesterday, body finally acknowledging the stress of the pull, competition, The victory that had cost him everything he could give. Rebecca helped him into a chair on the porch, brought him sweet tea, sat beside him, watching the late afternoon light paint the fields gold. So we live in a world where you can buy the newest, the fastest, the most powerful. We've got computers that predict soil moisture, calculate traction, optimize every variable. But when did we stop asking, do we understand what we already have? Marcus had 620 reasons to win. You had one reason never to quit. Which one mattered more? Walter didn't answer directly, just sipped his tea and looked at land that had made him who he was, that had tested him yesterday and found him sufficient, that would test him again tomorrow and every day after, until the ground finally took him back, the way it took everyone eventually. Rebecca put her hand on his. "Thanks for not giving up, Dad. Never crossed my mind, honey. Promises made to the right people don't have quit built into them." They sat together until sunset, painted the sky orange and purple and gold, until stars appeared overhead, until the temperature dropped enough that going inside became necessity instead of choice. Walter Hayes had saved his farm, found his daughter, passed knowledge to the next generation, kept every promise worth keeping. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The bank would need addressing. Drought would continue until it didn't. But tonight was for rest and gratitude and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes courage and faith and promises kept matter more than every rational reason they shouldn't. Have you ever seen someone refuse to give up when every rational reason said they should? Or maybe you've been that person holding on to something everyone said you should let go. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you fought for when the odds said you'd lose, but your heart said, keep trying. Because those stories, yours and Walter's, and everyone who's ever chosen promises over convenience, those are the stories that remind us what we're capable of when it matters most.